The Race History in Rock Creek program series, as I see many familiar faces, so I think you know, is a collaboration between Rock Creek Conservancy and Rock Creek Park to tell the full story of Rock Creek Park. So many of us know the main through lines of Rock Creek, but there are so many stories, including so many people who have had an impact on Rock Creek that we don't often hear of. And these programs, carefully managed by Tony and his colleague Romy, who is also a woman who has impacted Rock Creek with us tonight, are semi-monthly programs and opportunities to learn new things about Rock Creek and the people who have made it as wonderful it is today. You are in for a real treat this evening. You are going to hear about 3 amazing women who have had a significant impact on Rock Creek. But in addition to that, you are going to hear from 3 women, actually 4 women, who are having an incredible impact on Rock Creek. Our moderator, Ana Chuquin, who I will turn things over to in just a moment, who is the botanist in Rock Creek Park, is years from now, we will do a program on Ana Chuquin and the impact she has had on Rock Creek, not just on the plants and the vegetation there, but the efforts to make the park more inclusive and to ensure that the staff is really top notch. So if tonight is your first chance to meet Ana, I see some of our weed warriors. I know you know her and her power as well. You are in for a real treat if this is your first Ana experience. If it is not, you are still in for a real treat. And I see a few of Ana's colleagues from the park who are not necessarily speakers this evening. Brian Joyner, the deputy superintendent. I think I saw Molly from the volunteer team. We absolutely could not run this program and our partnership with the park without the really incredible team, many of whom are women, but some of whom, like Brian, are men, and make really great things happen for Rock Creek. The folks that you hear from tonight and the stories you hear tonight are, of course, not the entirety. We can't do the full story in 1 hour and a half. We do have some wonderful resources on our website from past programs that we've done, including some collaboration with the Friends of Pierce Mill to spotlight the history of Hattie Sewell and the way in which she ran the tea house at Pierce Mill. We also did a really wonderful program 1 or 2 summers ago where we heard directly from several women who've had an impact on Rock Creek, and those are the past several and current superintendent of Rock Creek, all of whom have been power women in my book, mentors to us. But it is now time to turn things over to the topic of the evening, which is a history of women who have had an impact on Rock Creek. So I will turn things over to Ana to introduce our amazing panel of speakers. And I will quickly give thanks again to the team at Rock Creek, Tony and Romy at the Conservancy, who helped make these programs possible. And of course, to all of you for being here, for participating in this conversation, and for helping make our work at the Conservancy possible. Thank you.
Jeannie, thank you so much for those kind words. I'm humbled to hear that, and I'm humbled by the messages that we're getting through the chat. Thank you so much. I do it from the bottom of my heart for the protection of the park and for the enjoyment of these and future generations that I have embraced that belief and that mission. Good evening to all. As Jeannie said, my name is Ana Chuquin. I am the botanist at Rock Creek Park. I'm delighted to be here tonight. I would like to start by thanking the Rock Creek Conservancy for providing a space for these meaningful and much needed conversations. For most of Rock Creek Park's history, or even before the park was created, women have played crucial roles in historical events, though with less display and formal power than men. This program will explore the ways in which notable women, including Rachel Carson, Beatrix Farrand, and Elizabeth Proctor Thomas, have shaped the environmental, the landscape architectural design, and the historical Civil War communities. And of course, Rock Creek Park as a whole. Our panelists tonight will share ways in which these women have left a wider legacy and the ways Rock Creek shaped them. The panelists will not only delight us with their presence, but will enlighten us with their knowledge about these very representative women. I would like to add that on top of being extremely knowledgeable on the lives of these women, our panelists are subject matter experts in their fields. They currently support the park and our community in different ways. I would like to thank them for all the work that they have done for Rock Creek Park, for the National Park Service, for the government of the United States, and for our community in general. Kym Elder of the National Park Service, and Aldrich of Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy, and Rebecca Henson from the Springsong Museum will kindly present tonight. Let's get started. Kym Elder is proud of her 35-year federal government career as a National Park Service employee. Over the past 3 decades, Kym has served as a manager of 7 different historical sites, parks, and program areas here in the National Capital Region. Kym loves the opportunities afforded her to share the vast histories of these special places. She especially enjoys sharing the stories and histories that are not often taught or found on history books. Kym currently serves as the program manager of the Civil War Defenses of Washington, with areas of responsibility that span across 3 different regional parks, to include Rock Creek Park, National Capital Parks East, and the George Washington Memorial Parkway. A second-generation native Washingtonian, Kym and her family enjoy traveling and spending time in this beautiful city and region, to include Rock Creek Park with her husband, adult children, and beautiful 2-year-old granddaughter. Kym, welcome, thank you, and please take it over. I think you're on mute.
Yes. Ana, thank you so very much. You're doing a great job. We appreciate all that you do. And if you haven't gotten out to the park to see all the beautiful vegetation that Ana's responsible for, do so. Again, thank you so very much. I have the pleasure this evening being invited to share information about Mrs. Elizabeth Proctor Thomas. And Tony, if you can go ahead and put that first screen up, we can see a picture of Miss Elizabeth Proctor Thomas, also known as Fort Stevens' original property owner. We have that slideshow ready to go. However, before I begin to talk about Elizabeth Proctor Thomas, I can't not talk about just about her biographical information. I must first set the stage and speak about her contributions, the sacrifices that she made to ensure that the Civil War defenses, the nation's capital, the capital that we live in and many of us work in, was saved. And so here's where we would be showing a photo of the Civil War defenses of Washington map. Because again, you can't talk about Elizabeth Proctor Thomas without talking about the sacrifices that she made. So we're not seeing that, Tony? There we are. Okay. So again, Elizabeth Proctor Thomas is who I'll be featuring tonight. Again, Fort Stevens' original property owner. Next slide, Tony. As I noticed, I can't begin to talk about her biographical history, her biographical sketch without talking about the sacrifices that she made. As a resident here in Washington in the 1860s, Elizabeth Proctor Thomas lived in Fort Stevens. That was her home. It was at that time known as Britain. And so I should just pause for just a second to talk about the fact that at the turn of the, right after the loss at First Manassas, the Union Army hired Colonel Bernard to come in and design fortifications to protect the nation's capital, as he was directed, Mr. Lincoln City. And in that fortification design, he actually they actually built 68 forts around Washington, D.C. Again, this map shows those 68 forts that encircled the city. Not only 68 forts, but over 40 plus miles of military road, rifle pits, batteries, all in support of this fortification. And so, again, at the start of the Civil War, German soldiers were hired by the United States Army to come in and prepare the land to build the forts. And one of those forts, of course, was Fort Stevens. Well, just at the start of 1862, Mrs. Elizabeth Proctor Thomas was met by these German soldiers. Next slide, please. She's known as Brightwood's most famous resident. Elizabeth Proctor Thomas was born on July 11, 1821 to Walter and Betty Proctor. She was born in St. Mary's County, Maryland, but shortly after her birth, the family moved to, again, an area known as Brighton. We now know it as Brightwood here in upper Northwest Washington. Mrs. Thomas was in possession of over 11 acres of land. That's what she was bequeathed by her family, land that we now know as Fort Stevens. Between 1898 and 1903, Mrs. Thomas sold several parcels of her land, but continued to reside in her home property right here on Piney Branch Road in Brightwood. At that time, Brightwood was considered a very important community. It's still an important community because it was there that the Confederate soldiers fought the famous Battle of Fort Stevens in an effort to take the city, in an effort to prevent the city from being taken from the South. In 1861, Mrs. Thomas and her husband owned and lived on the site in which Fort Stevens was built. Let me just pause here and note that in her own accounts, Mrs. Thomas talks about meeting Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was no stranger to the Brightwood area and particularly came to visit Fort Stevens on numerous occasions. As many of you all know, his summer home, Lincoln's Cottage, was located just a few short miles away from Fort Stevens. Now, again, as I've mentioned, Mrs. Thomas was known as the most famous resident of Brightwood and was almost always very friendly. Every year after the war, members of the Grand Army of the Republic would reportedly fought right alongside the battle, held their reunions on her porch and in her house, recounting the stories of the battle. Next page, next slide, Tom. So in 1862, again, the city is at battle. And the city has now, the Union Army has taken over her property, have built this earthen fort that is there, part of these 68 forts to protect the Union's nation. And so Mrs. Thomas was left here without anything, without a home, having to relocate very nearby, but having to relocate because her home was taken, of course, at that time. We now know it as eminent domain. She continued to live near the fort, providing support to the soldiers and even declaring that if needed, she'd pick up an arm, a firearm, and to defend her country right alongside the Union Army soldiers. As we talked about, Mrs. Thomas was a great civic leader. She continued to provide to her civic community, even during the war, just continued to do that. And then and by 1864, July 1864 to be exact, was when Juba Early and the Confederate Army called themselves marching down Georgia, what we now know as Georgia Avenue, setting up camp right at Walter Reed Hospital. And again, there was a battle that was ensued. And Elizabeth Proctor Thomas talks about that battle and being there to support the soldiers. And again, because of her contributions, I'd always like to say that Fort Stevens was the battle that saved Washington, D.C. So Mrs. Thomas, like many others after the war, found themselves without their property. The property was not what they had known it to be before the war, of course. And like many others, she placed in a request to be compensated by the government. The government was compensating these property owners for their property, for their contributions, their sacrifices made. And on several attempts, she went to Congress to be compensated for her property. We're talking 11 acres of land that she wanted to be compensated for. Unfortunately, we don't have any records of all of Mrs. Thomas being compensated for her sacrifices. What we can say is that Mrs. Thomas went on, as we've been talking about, to be known as the most famous resident of Fort Stevens. Even after the war, she continued to work in her community, even serving as a substitute teacher at some of the local schools, a substitute kindergarten teacher in some of the schools. While we know her story is of significance, here's this woman of color that played an important role in America's Civil War. The African-American neighborhood near Fort Stevens was a community of respectable, honest, hardworking, and most of all, freedom-seeking people who desired to help their nation live out its creed of freedom and equality for all men and all women of all races, creeds, and color. Again, Elizabeth Proctor Thomas, a resident here in Brightwood, took up arms when necessary, supported these soldiers, gave of her ultimate sacrifice as an African-American woman with little to nothing of all of her property to ensure and defend the nation's capital. Again, it is with pleasure that I present to you all Mrs. Elizabeth Proctor Thomas. Thank you.
Thank you, Kym. Yeah, it is a great story and example of what needs to be done for the right cause, and what she did for the right cause is exemplary. Thank you for sharing so much knowledge. I would like to invite people that have not been to Fort Stevens to visit the area, to walk around the area, and to also be aware of the festivities that take place in the months of July, so that they can learn more from you guys, from the experts within that area, and learn more from Elizabeth Proctor Thomas. Thank you, Kym.
So Ana, I want to just note that I'll be talking more about what happened afterward and her encounter with Lincoln as we begin our discussion and some of the questions that we have this evening.
Great, thank you. Let's continue. We're going to switch a little bit in terms of topics, but we are still within the big umbrella of Rock Creek Park. Rebecca Henson is the founder and director of Springsong Museum, a nonprofit working to create an accessible, welcoming community museum in Silver Spring, inspired by resident Rachel Carson. Rebecca also works part-time at Nature Forward, is a Maryland Master Naturalist, and serves on the board of the Neighbors of the Northwest Branch. And she's a mom of 2 nature-loving boys who motivate her every day to do more for our local environment. Rebecca, thank you for being here. Please take it over. Rebecca?
Yes. Can you hear me? It seemed paused. Yes. Okay.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry, my screen is, I hope it's sharing, but thank you for having me to the Conservancy. And I'm just so appreciative of all that Rock Creek Park has meant to me personally, and I think in the history of the city and the region, and of course the country as well. So I'll be talking about Rachel Carson. I could use the entire hour and a half to talk about her or more, so I'm going to try really hard to get through this quickly. But just pointing out here a quote that some of us might know from Rachel Carson. It's one that really focuses in on the wonders of the world, and then the responsibility that we have once we appreciate that wonder. All right. As an overview, many of us might have heard of Rachel Carson, and if so, it might be because many consider her the mother of the modern environmental movement. And locally, we might also know her because she lived her entire adult life here in Montgomery County, Maryland, mainly in Silver Spring, but also 2 years in Tacoma Park. And her work, like I just mentioned, was focused on both wonder and our responsibilities. So decades of her work was spent talking about the wonders of the sea and of the ocean, even though she hadn't seen the ocean until she was an adult. It was something that had sparked her interest as a child. And then at the very end of her life, but actually, throughout some of her writings, from the very beginning, there's also this responsibility, this stewardship for this nature that she loved so much. And it really comes to a fore in Silent Spring, where she focuses on this short-sighted attempt to control nature, and in this case, insects. And we might also know that she, because of writing Silent Spring, and not just writing it, but the whole process of being attacked by the industry at the time, the chemical industry, and the media that generated, and then her very public defense of the book and the science and just caring about ecology, all of that led to some of our most important environmental laws in the country, and also the creation of the EPA to regulate those laws. All right, and another, once, if you are familiar with some of those top line points on Rachel Carson, you might also have read some of her books. So she published 4 books during her lifetime, and they generally hit on most of the themes that are covered here. So the overarching goal that she had was to make science and nature accessible to all. And she says here, this notion that science is something that belongs in a separate compartment of its own, apart from everyday life, is one that I should like to challenge. So she believed that we could all learn and then, be stewards of nature and through science. Some of the other themes are, again, around accessibility, wonder, and all the power that wonder can have, both for the individual, but also for the environment. The idea of using all of your senses in nature, so smelling the pine needles or feeling bark. And then also she zooms way out in most of her writing at various points in the book or the article, and she talks about these ancient eternal cycles of life, this great stream of life that we're all part of, including the creatures and the plants and others. And that's something that's very kind of special, I think, about her writing. So even if she's writing about the American eel, she'll bring in these notions of this much more existential philosophy that makes her writing, I think, just really stick with people. And it's just something really, really beautiful and unique. It's this poetic prose that she has. And then finally, something that we see a lot with Silent Spring is a focus on ecology. So the interconnection between creatures and plants and their environment, and also the vulnerability of that web of life. So to try to quickly go through some biographical information, Rachel Carson was born in 1907 in Pennsylvania, and she was taught to love nature, or at least nurtured in that way, by her mother. And her mother was a strong believer in the nature study movement of the time. And here's a book that was central to that movement. So her mother and Rachel would spend a lot of time outdoors observing, and this was fundamental to Rachel's sense of herself as a person and her place in the world, but then also it gave her something later to rely on for a career. Her family in Pennsylvania suffered a lot from financial instability, and there was a lot of uncertainty around being able to pay for different things and pay for schooling. And when it was time for Rachel Carson to go to college, her mom sold a bunch of their belongings, and they also took out student loans. So this was, 100 years ago, and this is someone who had student loans then and knew the repercussions of them. And so eventually she did get a degree in biology, but she was also taking many classes in writing and had considered majoring in English, but she ended up focusing more on biology. And that took her, the very bottom left picture is of Johns Hopkins. So she moved to Maryland to go to Johns Hopkins to get her PhD. Unfortunately, well, first of all, her entire family moved from Pennsylvania to Baltimore to live with Rachel in grad school. And when that happened, Rachel also needed to take part-time jobs. So she started writing for the Baltimore Sun, pieces about getting to know our local environment and around the Chesapeake Bay. But eventually her father passed away, and Rachel then became really the sole breadwinner. And she ended up leaving Hopkins with a master's degree and not a PhD, so she could work multiple jobs more than full time. And she was also supplementing her income by teaching at the University of Maryland in College Park. So she quickly becomes, I think, a Maryland story too, not just, I like to focus on her life here in Silver Spring, but she spent some very important years in Baltimore and also teaching at College Park. And I'm going to skip some of this since I don't have much time, but this is these are some pieces of articles, that were written in the Baltimore Sun about fish and eels and turtles and other things that she would write about, and that provided a somewhat steady income. She also ended up submitting a piece to the Atlantic Monthly, and that was kind of her big break, her real entrance into a life that she would have a career focused on her personal writing. So in the late 30s, Rachel Carson moved to Silver Spring, Maryland, so she could be closer to her job and to some of the research that was being done around her job, for example, at Patuxent, but also in downtown DC and the libraries for the Fish and Wildlife Service. So at the time it was called the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, and her job was to, again, make science and nature accessible to the public. So she wrote and started these pamphlets called Conservation in Action. And the first one was on Chincoteague that we can see here. And she would just very clearly describe why, for example, in this case, a national wildlife refuge is needed. And that's because, looking at the map, this is where the birds flew from their winter ranges up to their summer breeding ranges. And it's just this little sliver that was really needed to be protected if we wanted to protect the entire, so many of these species. Fish and Wildlife Service is also where she first learned more about DDT and the potential impact on wildlife. So that was in 1945, so almost 2 decades before she wrote Silent Spring. She was editing information that was coming from Patuxent. These were the 3 books that she wrote that's kind of referred to as her Sea Trilogy. So starting in 1941, going through 1955, these books focused on the sea, different elements of the sea, but always with an ecological perspective. And the first book, for example, was through the eyes of different sea creatures. So trying to help the public see, the vast array of creatures that lived on or near or in the sea through their own lenses. And then we come to her fourth book that was published during her lifetime, Silent Spring, which again, I could talk probably for many, many hours about. But this was a book that she didn't really want to write. She was compelled to write it because of that wonder and love that she had for nature. So it was something, as we saw from the 40s, that she knew about the danger of pesticides. And this was her at the very, near the end of her life. This is the book that she wrote to explain that there is this major concern that unites public health and conservation and environment, and it kind of came together in this one book, where she really just asks for a more thoughtful approach to technology. Really, in this case, it's pesticides, but it's just waiting and thinking through various means of progress that society comes up with. And so, it was a major book, one of the most important books of the last century. And I wish I had more time to talk about it, but I will continue. I also had a video here, but we're not going to watch it because of time. But again, she was so focused on wonder, and at the very end of her life, she said that it would be, quote, heaven to achieve the ability to write a whole book on wonder. And the importance of nurturing a child's wonder. That was what was most important. And when she's talking about nature and wonder, she was talking about any type of experience with nature. So, planting a seed on your windowsill or walking to a park, and not always the vast expanses of nature and wilderness that you might think of with previous conservationists. She was really focused on the nature, at our doorstep or in our backyard. Sorry, we'll skip that. Okay, finally, getting a bit to Rock Creek Park. She was part of the Audubon Naturalist Society, which is now called Nature Forward. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to call it ANS, or Audubon Naturalist Society, because that's what it was called then. So after World War II, so many of the professionals that came to the city during the war and who stayed joined this organization that used to be really focused on birds. During the time that Rachel came, she helped by being a board member, an editor of their quarterly magazines, to transform the organization to something that was focused on nature, more broadly, habitat and conservation. So really widening the lens and considering conservation much more than just enjoying the birds. And this photo on the right is from Glover Archbold Park. It was Life magazine's photo from the early 60s. Rachel had an opportunity to take them to two locations. One was in nature. One was here on the Northwest Branch, and the other was one of the parks that is part of Rock Creek Park. So she's seen here bird watching and in a park that was very special to the Audubon Naturalist Society. And this, just a note that they were very active on making sure that Glover Archbold Park did not turn into a major highway. So you can see here, the right two pictures are kind of what was proposed for the highway, more or less gutting the natural environment that is so important, not only to the creatures, but also to a clean and healthy functioning city. So this would have taken a very natural environment and turned it into just a highway. And the Audubon Naturalist Society wrote article after article, and were very, very vocal about making sure that this part of Rock Creek Park remained as natural as it could be. And finally, one of the most important things about Rachel Carson and Rock Creek Park is that it was the source of her inspiration. So she had never heard the sound of a veery, one of the thrushes that lives around here. And she was taken there by, oh, sorry, that's the sound of the veery. She was taken here by Lewis Hale, who wrote Spring in Washington, because ANS was doing a ton of bird studies and bird counts that always included Rock Creek Park. And there he found nesting veeries. And so for the first time, she got to hear the sound of this ethereal bird. And she said here, as long as I live, I shall never forget my first veery, heard in Rock Creek Park in a green woodland twilight. And the reason that that is so important is that she had a very challenging rest of her life. She battled multiple physical ailments and then finally cancer when she was writing and defending Silent Spring. And she was always responsible for multiple family members, eventually adopting her grandnephew. They were always living with her. And so she needed a source of strength. And this was both a source of inspiration and strength, but it also pushed her to write Silent Spring, because she had said that she couldn't listen to these beautiful bird songs anymore if she wasn't doing all she could, if she wasn't taking action. And that spark, that moment, even though she was a birder all her life, came in Rock Creek Park. So I will end there, actually. I think just generally when we see bald eagles or robins anywhere in our area, we can pause for a moment and thank Rachel Carson for, bringing the public and government's attention to DDT and other pesticides. And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you for sharing all of that information. Thank you for sharing all your research, and thank you all for what you do for the community, for all your work on the museum. And I would like to conclude Rebecca's participation citing one of my most favorite quotes from Rachel Carson. Conservation is a cause that has no end. There is no point at which we say, all our work is finished. Thank you, Rebecca. For the people that are asking questions on the chat, please, you're encouraged, but we're going to wait until the end to answer all of those questions. So save them, put them on the chat right now, but we'll take them at the end. Thank you. Our next speaker is one that I have worked hand on hand for several years. Together, we have planned and executed multiple vegetation plan projects. I have to confess, though, that she and her army of volunteers are the ones that have done the heavy lifting. We all, however, have enjoyed the homemade cookies she and her husband baked for all of us after each and every event. Ana Aldrich has worked with the Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy since 2011 as a board member, executive director, restoration director, and now as a senior advisor and botanist. She has a master's in sustainable landscape design and a BS in botany. She worked in numerous positions for the Bureau of Land Management for 32 years. Anne and Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy are inspired by the impact Beatrix Farrand has had on the field of landscape architecture. And welcome, please take it over.
Thank you, Ana. It has been a real pleasure to work with you since 2011 to actually make a difference for a woman who made a huge difference in landscape architecture and still continues to influence us today. Thank you for inviting Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy to present on Beatrix Farrand during this Women's History Month. Ana has introduced me, so I need not, but hello to everybody who's participating. Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy is the only partner to Rock Creek Park that is dedicated to restoring Beatrix Farrand's masterwork, Dumbarton Oaks Park. This is her last remaining wild garden. Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy is a not-for-profit with the mission to restore, promote, and maintain Dumbarton Oaks Park now and for the future generations. Our work enables the mobilization of thousands of volunteers that Ana referred to restore this American treasure. And in the spirit of Farrand's rigorous dedication to the care of her masterwork, we continue it so it can be enjoyed by all. We welcome everyone to work with us and support the restoration of Dumbarton Oaks Park. Please reach out to us through our website, which should be listed in the chat. Tony, if we can go to the next slide. This is a classic portrait of Beatrix Farrand. She was born in 1872 and passed away in 1959. So she's the mid woman in the discussion tonight, and the middle person. She's known as the mother of landscape architecture, and her acclaimed designs can be enjoyed in public spaces across the country and in Europe. Here in this country, from colleges and famous parks to numerous private residences. She was working between the 1890s and the 1950s. Farrand was born into New York society, though by the time she reached adulthood, she had to find a career to support herself. Edith Wharton, who many of you may know, was her aunt and encouraged her interest in landscape design. The field of landscape design was only open to men at that time. And so Farrand enlisted Charles Sprague Sargent, the head of Harvard's Arnold Arboretum, to help her design a course of study so that she could gain those skills. She traveled extensively in Europe, studying the gardens in Italy and England, and she eventually completed over 200 commissions for private and public gardens. Her skilled design work led to the invitation in 1899 by 11 other men to be the only female founding member of American Society of Landscape Architects. She is regarded as one of America's foremost landscape practitioners in the 20th century. And she considered the formal and wild gardens of Dumbarton Oaks Estate in DC her crowning achievement. Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy was founded to save this iconic landscape from ruin over 12 years ago. Our work has revitalized Dumbarton Oaks Park, the last remaining Farrand designed garden. Farrand owed her success to her unerring eye for design, profound knowledge of horticulture, stormwater, and her deep commitment to her profession that inspired others to follow in her footsteps. She was famous for her complex flower borders and her advocacy of native landscapes and plants, which she wove into both the classical and naturalistic design frameworks of Dumbarton Oaks Estate. The Georgetown home of U.S. diplomat Robert Woods Bliss and his wife Mildred Barnes Bliss. Farrand also established a landscape study center at Reef Point in Bar Harbor, Maine, where students benefited from the demonstration gardens, an herbarium, and an extensive reference library that she had assembled over many years. Farrand was deeply influential in the way landscapes are designed and experienced today. Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy strives to uphold her vision, creating alliances at every level to accomplish our work and bring all kinds of people and ideas into the process of ushering this public life landscape and its stewards forward into its second century. Next slide. This is a springtime shot of the park. Farrand considered Dumbarton Oaks Estate, the 53-acre estate of Mildred and Robert Bliss, to be her masterpiece. She was invited by the Blisses in 1921 to work closely with them to design the country estate in the heart of DC. She worked for the Blisses for over 20 years as they designed the estate into two sections: the formal gardens near the house and the romantic wild garden park below. The estate bordered Rock Creek Park. Next slide. In 1940, the Blisses divided the property, gifting the formal gardens, buildings, and collections to Harvard, and the wild garden, Dumbarton Oaks Park, shown in green, to the people of the United States, to be managed by the National Park Service. Dumbarton Oaks Park is the only remaining wild garden designed by Farrand, and it is now managed under a public-private partnership with Rock Creek Park and Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy. Farrand worked for 10 years with the National Park Service to transition the park, the wild garden, into a public park by expanding the paths and creating new Clifton Hill paths so the public could experience the wonderful terrain and views afforded by visitors to the formal gardens. The park actually has 18 waterfalls and garden follies to tell her romantic story of leaving civilization and going out to the wilderness. Farrand also advised the Park Service on stormwater problems, plant selections, and plant replacements needed through the 1940s. Unfortunately, the Blisses did not endow the maintenance of the park. So, and it was also not documented design-wise. So the Conservancy has worked with a number of people to understand and restore the garden to an ecologically healthy wild garden that can survive the changing climatic conditions. Farrand also designed the East Garden of the White House in 1913 for First Lady Edith Wilson and numerous other gardens in the DC area. Greenspring Gardens in Alexandria has a section designed by Farrand that is currently still exists and is being restored. Next slide. Farrand was the first woman to break into and lead the male-dominated field of landscape architecture, especially at a time when women, particularly society women, did not work or have professions, and also at a time before women even had the right to vote. Farrand was a contemporary of Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect for Central Park, and Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., the landscape architect for our dear favorite Rock Creek Park. Farrand had many commissions from prominent citizens and institutions. Her designs still survive at Princeton, Yale, Santa Barbara Botanical Gardens, and many gardens around Bar Harbor, Maine. The National Park Service actually manages 3 Farrand gardens. One of her early commissions for her cousin at Belfield, now a part of the home of Franklin Delano Roosevelt National Historic Site. She worked with John D. Rockefeller in designing the carriage roads in Acadia National Park, and as we've been talking about, the wild garden of her masterpiece for Dumbarton Oaks Park. All of these designs share elements of design and that she used throughout her career. Take a look at the stone bridge in Dumbarton Oaks Park, which you can see here in this photograph, and go onto Acadia National Park's website and look at the bridges over for the carriage roads. You know it was a Farrand design bridge. Farrand is an iconic landscape architect who still informs and influences American landscape design today. Next slide. Farrand created a living work of art that serves as a place of respite to be enjoyed in every season. We hope you'll take a stroll through Dumbarton Oaks Park to experience her brilliant naturalistic design, which has reached a venerable 102 years this year. And spring is my absolute favorite time in the park. Thank you so much for inviting Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy to share the unique story of this urban park. The stewardship that this garden inspires is a great testament to the vitality of this open space in the urban core of the nation's capital. Thank you very much, Ana.
And thank you. Thank you for sharing who Beatrix Farrand was, how much she knew, and what she did for that magical area at Dumbarton Oaks Park. And not only what she did for the parks, but what she did for her field in general. Thank you. And we have prepared a couple questions to further the conversation and learn more from our panelists, Kym, Anne, and Rebecca. Please feel free to answer any of the following questions we have for you. Let's get started. How do the stories of Rachel Carson, Beatrix Farrand, and Elizabeth Proctor Thomas inspire future generations of women to engage with nature and conservation? If any of you like to take that question, please feel free.
Go ahead, Anne.
I will defer to you because I think Elizabeth Proctor Thomas is a pretty important woman.
I think so as well. And while she wasn't involved with the architect and the conservation, well, the conservation in the sense, the preservation of the Union. Elizabeth Proctor Thomas committed, knowing as an African-American woman that she didn't have a lot to give, but recognizing what she did give was an ultimate sacrifice to ensure the wholeness of the Union. She speaks in her memoirs of meeting Abraham Lincoln and the promises that he made to her, that she would be compensated. And as we all know, Lincoln met his demise on April 15th, 1865, down at Ford's Theater. We know that his promise to her was never kept. However, I am happy to note that the National Park Service, working very closely with the District of Columbia back in 2012, renamed Quackenball Street, the street that runs perpendicular to Fort Stevens, was renamed Elizabeth Proctor Thomas. And so while she was never, we don't have any evidence that she was ever compensated, that street will ever bear her name as Elizabeth Proctor Thomas Way. And as Ana noted, we invite you to come out to take a look at Fort Stevens, one of the 17 forts that the National Park Service manages today, completely restored back in the 1930s by the Conservation Corps. And so you could actually see what Elizabeth Proctor Thomas saw when she looked out on her property and what the soldiers had done, again, all in the effort to save the nation.
Thank you, Kym. Let's go to the next question, since we have questions from different angles and different topics. What challenges did these women face in their efforts to shape and preserve Rock Creek Park? And how did they overcome these obstacles?
Well, Ana, if I can, Farrand achieved a lot. Yes, she came from a fairly wealthy background and was very privileged from that upbringing. However, she didn't have any money, and I think that she does set an example of how to chart a course and overcome things. And she really represents a rare woman who entered and led a male-dominated profession in landscape architecture. I mean, she was the first professional woman landscape architect. And then I think that that challenge carried through her life and her work. She was often brought in with architects, and there's many stories of how she dominated the conversations with the men. She figured out how to lead the conversations and bring landscape design into many campuses and public parks. And then I think when she worked with the Park Service in the 1940s, as we know, was dominated by males, professionals. The women that are seen in the historic photos were secretaries, and they played an important role. But Farrand, as a professional, had to deal with that professional jealousy and that professional bias of a male agency. And she really overcame that and gave us a great contribution.
Thank you, Anne. Yes, I spot on answer. Anybody else? Rebecca, would you?
Yeah,
Go?
I'll add, you know, Carson as a woman is something I've kind of thought about for the last few years, because she's very, while she was in, like we were just talking about, a very male dominated government job, she wasn't a secretary. She was one of two professionals that were hired by the Bureau of Fisheries in the 1930s. So only two women. But at the same time, when you look at interviews or letters, she somehow either didn't experience slights or jealousy, or what I think is she was she could be very focused on her job, on her goal, almost myopically so. And I think that might have also affected the way that she perceived her work environment. She kind of tuned out the noise pretty well. And so that's kind of the accounts that we have, is that she didn't suffer discrimination or anything in the workforce. But at the same time, you know, she was expected to be at home and but she was also a breadwinner. So she's very, very unique. Where she really did experience a lot of pushback and hatred was after publishing Silent Spring. So a lot of the criticisms that came were really gender loaded, like calling her a spinster who had no reason to care about the next generation because she didn't birth any children herself, or saying that she's not a real scientist because she only had a master's degree, whereas a lot of both scientists and other professionals in the same environment at the time didn't have a PhD as well. So, and I remember there was one article describing the book as having shrill voices and emotional and inaccurate outbursts throughout it. So that's where you really, really see her experience as a woman in the early 1960s.
Thank you. I think you and Anne have touched on the next question, but I'm going to ask it in case that you can think about anything else, or if you can want to respond as well. In what ways have women historically been excluded from formal power and recognition? And how does this impact their legacies in places like Rock Creek Park?
So I'll take that one. As I've noted throughout my presentation this evening, Elizabeth Proctor Thomas, while had she taken her request to the U.S. Congress, as many others had after the war and the forts were decommissioned, we again have no record of her receiving any compensation. There was something much later on that noted that she received a little over $1,800 for her sacrifices for her property, and that it was received 1 year before her death in 1916. However, the family has not confirmed that she ever received anything at all. And so simply because she was not only a woman, but an African-American woman at the turn of the 20th century, going before Congress, requesting monies that were due to her like so many others, and she never received it. Yet she did not become bitter. She continued to work in her community. As I noted, prior to her death, she had formed an organization named after her, which she served as the president, that was specifically to continue to build in the community, give legacy to the community, and to support the community in any ways that she could. And as I noted, she also, without even an education, went on to become a substitute teacher in the District of Columbia Public School setting system right there in Brightwood. So she continued to overcome despite the many obstacles that were simply against her, simply because of her gender and the color of her skin.
Thank you. Thank you. Then considering all the answers that have been provided so far, let me ask you, how can we ensure that the stories of women that have contributed to Rock Creek Park and other natural spaces are better integrated into the educational and public programming?
Ana, if I can, I would, and this sort of touches on my thoughts on the previous question as well. I think that we need to see our budgets prioritized, the agency budgets prioritized in a different way in order to bring these stories forward. Dumbarton Oaks Park was designated one of the earliest designations on the National Register of Historic Places in 1967. However, the Park Service, for various reasons, never prioritized funding to maintain, conserve, and bring forward that gift to the United States. And I do think that part of it is because it was not designed by a male. It wasn't a Frederick Law Olmsted Park. It was a Beatrix Farrand Park. And we have to fund the stories. We have to fund the preservation of these places in order for the next generations to understand and appreciate and celebrate.
Thank you, Anne. Any other answers?
Yeah, I think it was really helpful for me. I live in Silver Spring. When I first learned that Rachel Carson lived her whole adult life here, wrote Silent Spring, wrote her books on the sea, which she won a National Book Award for, and that my background was in environmental policy and history, and I had no idea that she had lived here. And so that's what motivated us to try to create this museum. But it was where we hope to have DCPS and MCPS come through and learn not just about Rachel Carson, but all of her predecessors and those in the community today who are maybe unsung heroes. And so that was something that was just eye-opening to me, my own ignorance. Even though there are on the trail here in the Northwest Branch, there are some wonderful interpretive signs that talk about Carson, but how many times I must have walked by it and never saw it. And anyway, it's a great question, how to actually affect the change so that more can learn about these women. I also wanted to recommend a book by a local advocate. This is called Rachel Carson and Her Sisters. And the sisters are not her real sisters. It's women who have been influential in the conservation and environmental movement, some of whom influenced Carson directly. But this was written by the Bethesda-based Robert Musil, who runs the Rachel Carson Council. But I'd highly recommend it because it really talks about the community that came together to create the environmental change especially in the 1960s.
And may I add that we can learn more about Elizabeth Proctor Thomas and the sacrifices that she has done every day in Fort Stevens. But we also have a day that is known as the annual Lincoln Thomas Day. And then back in September 22nd, 1924, 99 years ago this year, the National Federation of Colored Women's Club of America held their session, and they declared that there was going to be a Memorial Day in honor of Abraham Lincoln and Lincoln Thomas, and all of the churches and the schools. And so on September 22nd, 1924, the National Federation of Women then eventually turned into the National Association of Colored Women's Club, came to Fort Stevens along with a cadre of veterans to honor both the uncommon relationship of two persons, Abraham Lincoln and Elizabeth Proctor Thomas. And we have been meeting at the Fort Stevens Day, continuing this honor. And we're so excited to announce that we'll be hosting the 99th anniversary. And Tony, if you could possibly pull up that my PowerPoint once again and go down to the very bottom where we have the flyer announcing that we'll be hosting this annual day on September the 16th, 2023 in Fort Stevens, as we've always done now for the last 15 to 20 years. Because at one point it stopped, it ceased, but working together with our friends at the Military Road Preservation Trust, we have began celebrating Lincoln Thomas Day again. And it's a grand occasion. We bring, as they did back 99 years ago, bringing school children together at Fort Stevens and many, many persons, guest speakers, to come and celebrate again this relationship between Abraham Lincoln and Elizabeth Proctor Thomas. So while we're excited about the 99th anniversary, of course, we're elated about the 100th anniversary. And so we're going to bring lots more information back to everyone about this opportunity to celebrate 100 years of this relationship between Abraham Lincoln and Elizabeth Proctor Thomas and the sacrifices that both of them made for the preservation of our union.
Thank you, Kym. I think that is a great segue to the next question that I have, which is, how have experiences of women who have shaped Rock Creek Park differ from those of men? And what can we do to learn from those differences?
I think, Ana, all three women had hurdles they had to overcome in their life. And much of it was because of gender and color, especially in Elizabeth Proctor Thomas's case. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure how much, I mean, things have changed, but I think professional women who are serving their community are still facing that challenge of being recognized as true leaders in their communities and in their professions. And yet we continue, all us women continue to try and make a difference and make our world better in all different forms and ways, so that we can all live peacefully and hopefully happily and responsibly in our environment.
Thank you, Anne. And I think that is a really great segue to the next question I have for any of you, which is, what can we do to make sure that women continue to be a driving force in the conservation movement and are given equal opportunities to shape the natural world?
I'll take this one, and I'd like to just again give applause to Rock Creek Conservancy and a partnership with the National Park Service. It is our mission, of course, to continue to tell these histories, to share this history, to have relevant programming, and to be able to visit sites where you can actually see the work of these women and the dedication of these women. So to continue to support to continue to, again, someone noted how it's important to talk about funding levels and the request for funding levels to ensure that these histories don't die, that the contributions that they made well over a century ago are still important today, and that particularly as women, that we continue to tell our children, and particularly our little girls, that they too can make a difference. And despite the odds and obstacles that come before them, that that women do matter, and that we make the world go around. No matter what anyone says, we make the world go around. And that these three women that we've highlighted tonight are just a blip on the screen as to all the many, many women that are doing so many things. So it is our responsibility, each of us on this call, each of us throughout the world, to continue to share the histories, the contributions that they made, and that we, again, continue to do the work that they've done. We stand on their shoulders. I'll leave it at that.
Follow on their footsteps. Thank you, Kym. I think we only have 2 more questions, but I think the questions are getting more and more interesting as time goes on. So let me go to the next one. What role do you all think botanical gardens and public parks like Rock Creek Park play in the preservation of local ecosystems and the education of the public on environmental issues?
They are key. If you look at our cities, the majority of the land is under development. Our parks, our botanical gardens are our learning labs. It's our teaching, it's our classroom to begin to bring and introduce, especially our children, but also our adults, into an understanding of what our human environment is. I mean, we're not separate from the natural world, but our built environment oftentimes has put up a barrier for people to understand and participate and learn about the natural world. So I think parks and botanical gardens are absolutely key to continuing our own education as humans on how to balance things and how to bring things back into beauty and balance.
Yeah, and I would just add, in addition to the educational benefits and even mental health benefits and all of that, it also just technically helps prevent against fragmentation for different species to have these slivers of green, just like you can imagine with Rock Creek Park, but even the various, like Glover Archbold, these are slivers that are kind of lifelines to some of these creatures to get from one place to another and to maybe rest or find some food on their journeys. So it technically also is just critical.
Thank you. Last but not least, I think this somebody has been asking questions about this topic as well on the chat, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But let me ask you this right now. How can we encourage more diverse voices and perspectives to participate in the conversation about conservation? And what impacts these might have on the future of Rock Creek Park and other natural spaces?
I think all voices have to be heard. We all come from different cultures, different economic groups. We have different relationships with the land. We have different relationships with each other. And if we can't open a conversation between all of us, somebody will get left out to the detriment of our whole society. And I think it's incumbent on every organization, every agency, every school to try and open those conversations.
Thank you, Anne. Anybody else?
I'll just note that I diddle that. it's imperative that we do just that.
And I think with Rachel Carson too, she was an example of, she was white and a woman, but she had tremendous physical challenges and was in a wheelchair at the end of her life. You know, she was also extremely sensitive, and I think that's where a lot of her insights came. But she can be a role model for those who might be shy or introverted, and I think that's also a segment of our population that might not feel empowered sometimes. But that was very much who Rachel Carson was, and she would find these reserves of strength to make a difference in the world.
Yet, if given the support and the room for it, they can just shine. Thank you. Thank you all for responding to all of these questions. I think we're gonna go into the chat and questions from the attendees today. We will do this rather in a fast-paced mode, given that we only have 10 more minutes for our meeting today. The first question is for Rebecca. Is there a link to the Rachel Carson video you mentioned? People really wanted to see the video.
I know. I love showing it because it was a ABC channel. ABC did a beautiful episode or hour-long show on her sense of wonder in the 1960s after she passed away, and it's the actress Helen Hayes who's narrating, and it's really lovely. We found this video deep in her archives and it needs to be restored. And we hope to show it at the museum. That's kind of one thing we'd love to do. But if anyone would like to email me, I can directly send you a link. It would just have to be kept to yourself. But it's a wonderful way to get to know her. So please email me.
Thank you. The next question is for Anne, and you have responded on the chat, but for just in case for people that have not read it, was Beatrix Farrand alive when the Blisses divided the property? If so, do we know what her thoughts were about that, since they were designed integrally?
Actually, Farrand was very much alive. The Blisses divided the estate in 1940. And Farrand died in 1959. One of her pieces of advice to the Blisses was to change the name of Dumbarton Oaks Park, which the Blisses called the Wild Garden, to something that would not confuse with Dumbarton Oaks, which is the name that Harvard was going to keep for the property. I think Farrand was happy that although they're two different landowners of the property, her masterpiece was still intact. And the Blisses donated the Dumbarton Oaks Park to the people of the United States because they did not want Whitehaven Street going through and impacting the park, and which serves as the backdrop to the formal gardens. So if you go to Dumbarton Oaks formal gardens, what is the background, the backdrop for the formal gardens and the beauty that's created and spaces that are created in the formal gardens is the park. And then she worked with the Park Service for 10 years, more than 10 years, to help them transition from a private garden to a public garden. And she also was employed by the Blisses to document Dumbarton Oaks, the formal garden. She actually did document the design. She documented all the plants. She talked about how they should be maintained. And that's known as the Dumbarton Oaks Plant Book. Unfortunately, that wasn't funded for the park. So we're left to do a lot of garden archaeology.
Thank you. I have another question, and it's a very important question. How can we invite the participation of Native American organizations and women in this discussion of nature conservation?
I can just mention at our plans for the museum, we are creating in our plans space for, because we're a place-based organization, or hope to be, we feel it imperative to have space to tell the story of the land, including Native American history, the Anacostan tribe that lived near where the museum would be. And so I don't have the expertise, but it's in our formal plan to seek that expertise and to, at the moment, at least carve out space. And the nice thing too is that anytime, with talking about conservation, especially with Rachel Carson, so many of her philosophies were very similar to some of the high level philosophies and beliefs of at least local Native Americans. And so we think there could be a lot of synergy and, a lot of kind of community building too, in that where we see how different people and communities have used this one piece of land where the museum will be over time, and really get to that idea of interconnection.
Thank you.
And
Kym,
I
would
would
you
just,
like to
I would just add, Ana, that this is the right forum to bring that up and to get those the juices flowing. Tony does a great job of just kind of incorporating a number of different topics into the Race and History series. So I know that he's already made note of that, and looking forward to, working with him and the team to develop more programming around not just Native Americans with conservation, but just Native Americans in Rock Creek Park. And I know that we have something already underway. And so look forward to just talking more about that and getting that out for everyone to know as well.
Right. The Conservancy in the past has worked with Rock Creek Park to present Native peoples program for elementary school students in Dumbarton Oaks Park. And I think if we are to do it again, one of the things we would do is invite the local representatives of, the tribes in the area to come in and help with that class. There's a lot of artifacts in Rock Creek Park and in Dumbarton Oaks Park that we need to have a bigger conversation about.
Thank you, Anne.
Just as a visitor, can I just quickly say something here? I think a good place to start would be with the Museum of the American Indians. And there's a Congress of the American Indians. So you have a lot of resources there, not just historical, but people who are specialized in sciences. Because really, this whole Chesapeake region is about the coming together of the indigenous people, the European people, and the African people. And many of the natural resources were basically the foundation of the transatlantic trade. So this knowledge and information is going back to Europe from George Washington. I know for a fact I used to be a part-time history interpreter at Mount Vernon. He's sending this, he sees himself as a farmer, he's sending this information back. He and Jefferson and Ben Franklin are literally sitting down with the tribal leaders and learning about territories, species, things. So it's not an accident that you're seeing these influences, but these people and their contributions have been erased. So even if you go to the Capitol, to the portrait gallery, you see the mural of Pocahontas, but you also see the symbols of the Europeans with the science. So I think now with climate change and environmental sustainability and renewability as the focus, not just of the Chesapeake region, but the nation and the world, we can go higher with this. So I just want to put that out there.
Thank you, Rebecca. I know that it is also one of the top priorities for the current Secretary of Interior.
Yes, Deborah Havlin, yeah.
Yes, and I think it is a great idea for us to engage into that topic and be more active about it. Thank you. I see that the address and the information for the museum, the Springsong Museum, is listed on the chat. And I just want to recognize that it's almost about time. So I think we are ready to take any last minute questions, if there are any. And if not, I think I would like to once again thank our panelists and reflect into from being a force to save the environment on a worldwide scale to being able to share all her possessions for the right and just cause, to being one of the first women landscape architects. Our panelists have proven that the importance and leadership of these women and the importance that they have through Rock Creek Park history and environments. These and many other women have left an immense legacy that is not only followed and exemplified by our panelists, but hopefully will inspire the next generation with the purpose of making this world a better place. I would like to thank our panelists and all of you for attending. I'm gonna pass it on to Tony. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you all so much. On behalf of the Conservancy, I just want to thank our panelists again. In celebration of International Women's Month, what a wonderful event. I know that I learned a lot being DC born and raised. There was a lot of things that I heard for the first time. So I'm just so grateful for you all sharing your expertise and experience with the audience tonight. And again, if you enjoyed our event tonight, please check out our Race History in Rock Creek webpage, where you'll be able to view past recordings from all of our events. And I also just wanted to share that this event will be recorded, and we'll try and get this recording out within the next 2 days or so. But thank you again to our moderator, Ana. Thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to all of you for attending tonight. What a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Have a good evening. Thanks so much.
Good evening.